Chapter 6. I can't be absolutely sure, of course. But I think the will is valid. Constance almost smiled. Peter Tembisa was like all experienced lawyers, he would never make a statement and claim it was completely true. If Constance had asked him for an opinion of the weather, he would surely go to the door of the office, check that the sky was blue and the sun shining brightly, and return to say that, in his considered opinion, it seemed to be bright sunny weather, but there was always a possibility he might be proved wrong. The main difficulty was that Mrs. Clark had died before putting her signature on her last will and testament. There was the added problem that the only witness to the fact that these really were the dead woman's wishes was Constance herself. She could not allow either Bokiti or Jacob to be witnesses because they were mentioned in the will as people who would benefit. So long as there are no relatives, there won't be any difficulty, Peter Tembisa said. And then added, in his usual careful way, unless a judge rules otherwise, that is, and that's always a possibility, isn't it? Mrs. Clark said that there were no relatives, Constance replied, except for Daniel, of course. What about Mr. Clark? Peter asked. What about Daniel's father? She said that she was a widow, Constance explained. Check that, Peter said. But most important of all, find Daniel. He was standing by the window, looking out. He sighed, such a beautiful day, and here we are shut up in offices and shops and factories. It all seems such a waste of time. We have to do business, Constance replied. You said yourself. We're in business to make profit. Yes, Peter replied, but as you get older, Constance, you'll learn that there's more to life than piling up money. I already know that, Constance replied, laughing. But I'd like to make a pile of my own nevertheless. And I'm sure that you shall, Peter told her. He checked his wristwatch. Go out and be successful. Constance walked out of the office and into the bright sunshine. GD was not with her. Mrs. Maribi had promised that GD could take the next day out of the office, but he was needed that afternoon for urgent duties. It was 2 o'clock. There were 3. She left to begin the search for Daniel Clark. This is me. Constance would not waste valuable hours. She had a letter signed by Peter Theritizer. She was formally dressed. She had her black briefcase. She did not anticipate too much trouble. Searching for a person is not as difficult as many people think, Constance reminded herself. There are records in many places. Constance knew that the government has information about us, health, education, taxes, that kind of thing. So does the local government, which deals with housing, local taxes, and such. Much of this information is available to the public. The police also keep records. At least of anyone who has committed a crime, even something not very serious, such as speeding in an urban area. This information is not available for members of the public to see, but in cases of emergency certain people have access to it. The death of a woman, and the search for her only son, might be such an emergency. Constance decided that first she would check the list of electors in general and local elections. Not everyone is on these lists, but most people are, because most people want to vote for councillors or members of the National Assembly. She chose to do this first because she knew that these lists are open for inspection by members of the public. She had an idea that the lists were kept at the central library in the city, so that was where she went first. A female assistant greeted Constance pleasantly. Constance explained what she wanted to read. She was directed to a room upstairs, the reference library. Here, a male assistant soon brought the lists. There was no difficulty. They were in alphabetical order toward the city. The name Constance wanted. Clark was near the beginning of the lists. She was quite surprised to discover that there were several people by the name of Clark. No more than 12, in fact, but more than she had expected. Mrs. Clark's name was on the list, Clark, Emily Louise. There were 3 men, and one was Daniel Clark. Constance was delighted. She had found Mrs. Clark's son without any difficulty. Peter Tembisa would be pleased. Even Mrs. Maribi might admit that even young people have value. Next to the names there were numbers. These were for use on the actual days when people voted in elections. By giving everyone a number, it was possible to stop cheating, just as in examinations at school or college or university. In addition, each name was followed by a home address. Constance made a note of Daniel's address. She noted that 2 females also lived at this address. It seemed that Daniel was married and had a daughter. Mrs. Clark had died without ever knowing that she was a grandmother. Constance took a taxi to Sunnyvale. Again, she made sure that the driver gave her a receipt. The suburb where Daniel Clark lived was similar to that in which his mother lived, or had lived. Constance found it difficult to remember that Mrs. Clark was dead, and that she had died while holding her hand. The streets of Sunnyvale were lined with trees, in full blossom at this time of the year. People become sick, and people die, but nature goes on in the same way. There is a time for blossoming and a time for fruit. A time to be born and a time to die. This was not a district where very wealthy people lived, but it was prosperous enough. All the houses had garages for motor cars. The gardens were large and well kept. At the back of the houses there was accommodation for servants or gardeners. Many houses had swimming pools. Daniel Clark must be in employment. It seemed that he was married and had at least one child. As she walked up the garden path to the house, Constance suddenly felt less sure that she had found Daniel. At least, that she had found the Daniel she wanted to find. If one woman was his wife, and the other his daughter, then the daughter must be over the age of 18, otherwise, she would not have had her name on the list of voters. But Daniel Clark was not old enough to have a grown-up daughter. However, it was possible that his wife already had a child when she married Daniel. He may have married a woman much older than himself. The door was opened by a middle-aged woman. She was a white woman aged about 40 to 45. "Yes, can I help you?" she said. Constance Majolo explained who she was and who she worked for. She said that she wished to contact Daniel Clark. "What's it in connection with, my dear?" the woman asked. "I'm Mrs. Clark." And then she added, "Won't you come in out of the heat?" Constance was shown into a cool sitting room. Mrs. Clark offered her something cool to drink. Constance said that a glass of water would be fine. "I don't think that the Daniel Clark I'm searching for can be your husband," Constance said, "unless your husband." She was going to mention the big difference in ages but decided that such a remark would not be polite. "Unless your husband's mother is called Emily Louise." At that very moment, a motor car drew up near the house. A man aged about 50 got out. He was wearing a railway worker's uniform. This was Daniel Clark, but not the one Constance wished to meet. Now that she realized this was not the right address, all she wanted to do was to leave quickly and continue her search elsewhere. Mr. and Mrs. Clark were in no hurry to let her leave, however. Constance had to repeat her story for Mr. Clark's sake. Constance soon learned that neither this man nor his wife knew Emily Louis. Clark. They were not related. And more important, as far as Constance was concerned, they did not know of any other Daniel Clark in that city, nor any other part of the country for that matter. "I'm sorry. I've wasted your time," Constance said, as she stood up and moved toward the door. "No problem," the man assured her. "Why did you say you wanted to find this other guy?" It's a private matter," Constance said. She had been careful not to reveal the true reason for her wishing to find Daniel Clark. Some matters are private, and should remain private, even after a person is dead. At the door Constance had a new thought. "May I check your directory?" she asked. "What was that?" Mrs. Clark asked. Mr. Clark had gone to a bedroom to change out of his working clothes. "I'd like to check the telephone directory, please, if I may." Mrs. Clark told Constance that was no problem. Constance returned to the sitting room. Mrs. Clark brought the telephone book from another place. "What name did you say, my dear?" "Clark," Constance told her to. "Oh, yes, of course." "Silly old me," the woman said, and she laughed out loud. "I'll check," Constance said. "No problem," Mrs. Clark assured her, flicking over the pages. There was a problem. The print in the telephone directory was small and Mrs. Clark needed to wear reading glasses. Because her glasses were in another room, however, she tried to find the name without them. This meant that she took longer than she need to have done. "There's A.D. Clark here," she said at last. "Let me see," Constance said. She took hold of the directory. Sure enough, there, among a few other Clarks, was A.D. Clark. As well as the telephone number, there was a name and an address, but no way of knowing if the person was male or female. Constance guessed that it must be a man. Women usually put their full names in directories of this kind after first making a note of the address and the telephone number. Constance again thanked the woman for her assistance. "Are you going round there, to that place?" she asked. Constance nodded and said that yes, she was. It would take some time, she thought, because the address was on the other side of the city. For a moment she believed that Mrs. Clark was going to offer her a lift, but she did not do so. "You can ring from here," she said instead. "That's very kind of you," Constance replied, "but I think I ought to go there in person. This is a delicate matter." "Somebody in serious trouble?" Not really," Constance replied. "I thought." "Well, you being from an attorney's office, you know. We don't always deal in crime or bad news," Constance assured her. It seemed to take a long time to say farewell and thank Mrs. Clark for all her help. There is no way of rushing these things, however. This woman had been very helpful. It was not her fault that her husband just happened to be the wrong Daniel Clark. Some suburbs do not have a regular bus service. Sunnyvale was one such. Because most people have their own form of transport, there is no need for buses. No bus company could make a profit by running buses there regularly. The profitable routes are those to suburbs where people rarely have their own transport and yet must get into the city every day for work. So it was almost an hour before Constance finally found transport in the form of a taxi en route back to the city after dropping off a customer. Constance sat in the back seat of the taxi, grateful to be out of the hot Sunday, glad to be able to take off her shoes. She told the driver the address she wanted. He said it was away from his usual route. Constance guessed this was not the truth. It was his way of demanding extra money, which she agreed to pay. After all, she could charge the cost to Tembisa and Associates. Much more important, she would soon learn if the D. Clark who was in the telephone directory, but not on the list of those able to vote in elections, was Daniel, the son of Emily Louise Clark.